Good morning, Georgetown. This is Radio Free Wilco. And on this 175th anniversary of this county's establishment, we thought it would be interesting to present some actual history. This is the Williamson County Sun from November 16, 1916. Which is the date on which this here Confederate monument was displayed. But I thought it would be a good day to finally read into a video, read to the county what was said on behalf of this monument when it was erected. So the Williamson County Sun opened, its first page that day was an article about the unveiling of the monument. And then they printed the speech that was given by Representative James Buchanan. There's a lake out there named after him. So I'm just going to read those in, read the whole thing. A little bit of commentary here and there, but the whole thing, full context, nothing left out. So the headline for the article is Confederate Monument Unveiled Last Friday. Work of UDC, that's United Daughters of the Confederacy, of Williamson County consummated. Taylor School Children Unveiled Monument. A wonderful parade. Speeches by Miss Daffin and Congressman Buchanan. Here's the content of the article. The monument to ex-Confederate soldiers erected on the courthouse square by the Daughters of the Confederacy was unveiled and dedicated at 2 p.m. Friday, November 10, in the presence of an immense crowd, variously estimated from 3,000 to 5,000 people. So that crowd was right where I am, and that's this monument right here. And the speech that I'm going to be reading in a minute was delivered from the porch directly behind me. At least I assume so. It might have been a platform right where I'm sitting, but I assume that it was from the porch. Every section of Williamson County was represented, and many visitors from neighboring counties were present. An interesting feature of the program was a parade which formed the public school building a few blocks away and marched around the square and to the place of assembly. The Young Men's Business League Band, playing patriotic airs, led the march, followed by the old Confederate soldiers who, from almost every section, had responded to the call and were present. When the command, "Fall In," was given by Captain John W. Snyder, commander of Camp Lesueur, some 45 members were ready and at the order right dress, with the weight of from 65 to 80 years or more resting upon them. They straightened up like soldiers and stood at attention, as they did 50 years ago. And at the command "Forward March," they again followed the old flag, the Stars and Bars, which was borne by Dr. W.G. Pettis, who served in Company F, Willis Battalion. The members of the various chapters UDC, that is, chapters United Daughters of the Confederacy, of the county followed the old soldiers. Then came the children of the county schools, several hundred strong. Southwestern University students came next, and the Georgetown Fire Department in full uniform and with their auto trucks and other firefighting paraphernalia. It's charming old language. Brought up the rear of this most interesting procession. Special seats had been arranged for the veterans and for the Daughters of the Confederacy near the speaker's platform, and soon after the arrival of those who had taken part in the parade, the program opened with music by the band. County Judge Richard Kritz, who presided over the meeting and introduced the speakers, made an excellent and appropriate talk. He said briefly that the purpose of the occasion, more than 50 years after the war, was not to rake up the ashes of the past and to rekindle the animosities engendered during the strife, but as true sons and daughters of Confederate soldiers, to express anew the love and reverence in which the South will ever hold them. Let's see whether that promise is kept in the speech that comes later. The monument was erected, he said, to the heroism of the men who, for 4 years, made sacrifices, endured hardships, and incurred dangers for a cause they believed was right. And while we are today loyal to the Stars and Stripes, we're loyal also to the memory of the Stars and Bars. And the South as a people will hold in reverence forever the greatest army that ever marched to battle in any country. The monument will stand as evidence of their patriotism and as assurance that their memory will be forever cherished and venerated by posterity. People will sometimes say that the monument is history, but it's veneration, cherishment. Miss Daffin speaks on behalf of UDC. In introducing Miss Katie Daffin, Judge Kritz referred to her as having been 3 times the efficient president of the state organization UDC, and as having done more perhaps than any other woman in Texas toward keeping alive a love and reverence for the men who wore the gray, and also for the preservation of the true history of their valorous deeds. Ms. Daffin said, "This should be a day of rejoicing and thanksgiving throughout the county, for it marked the attainment of the object for which the UDC members had been so earnestly striving, the erection of a monument to the Confederate soldier. It is the custom of all countries," she said, "to build monuments to commemorate important events, honor great deeds, and to mark the progress of civilization." You have to wonder which of these this had been for. The daughters had erected this monument to the men who had fought for what they believed was right, and that its purpose was not to keep alive any sectional bitterness, but to honor bravery and patriotism. Miss Daffin referred to her visit to Georgetown when the movement to erect the monument was in its incipiency and paid a high tribute to the noble manhood of Colonel F.T. Roche, whose deep interest in the cause she recalled, and which interest, his friends know, remained with him to the last. Miss Daffin emphasized the necessity of studying history and keeping a close watch so that no injustice shall be done the cause so dear to every Southern heart. Led by the band and directed by Mrs. B.C. Roche, about 1,000 school children and many of their elders joined in singing Dixie, the first notes of which called for the old-time rebel yell, and prolonged applause followed the song as the drapery was drawn, revealing the beautiful marble statue. This loving act, as performed by little Miss Karen Connolly of Taylor, chosen from the school in the county that had made the largest contribution to the Monument Fund. She was attended by her young friends, Yvonne Bledsoe and Irene Mediok, also of Taylor. The shaft was then entwined with a festoon of cedar, and around its base were scattered white roses by the following Georgetown schoolgirls: Catherine Price, Mary Sue Burcham, Ariana Taylor, Mary Moses, Catherine Stone, Margaret Price, Baroness and Gladys Huffstutler, Ginny Davis, Mabel Peasley, Dory Clark, Agnes Griffin, Calita and Roberta McElroy, Louise Woodley, Grace Hudson, and Molly Davis. One of the finest features of the program was the song by Dr. A.I. Manchester, Dean of the Old Fine Arts Department of Southwestern University, and the Glee Club, "Tenting on the Old Campground," which is a mournful kind of a song. This beautiful song was heard from beginning to end in profound silence by the vast crowd, and at its close, there were tears in many eyes. Congressman Buchanan speaks, so they have the article and then, the speech. So, in introducing Honorable J.P. Buchanan, member of Congress from the district, the principal speaker of the occasion, Judge Critz referred to him and the record he has made in the House as a staunch defender of the South and her history and traditions. Actually, if you look up this guy's congressional record, he introduced like 3 laws over like 6 or 10 years. One of them had to do with regulations on hemp manufacturing. I mean, it was absolutely trivial. He was not a major legislative figure. Mr. Buchanan spoke about 1 hour and a half, and his address consisted in the main of a carefully prepared and strong historic argument in favor of the right of secession by the Southern states. Now, you will recall that Judge Critz had just a moment ago said that we're not here to rekindle any of our issues, but we are going to insist that we were right. You can't do both of those. It is published in full elsewhere in The Sun, and will be read with interest, even by those who heard him deliver it last Friday. At the conclusion of his address, many of the old soldiers and others in the audience went forward to meet Mr. Buchanan and Miss Daffin, both of whom had contributed so largely to the success of the occasion. The weather was ideal, and every feature of the program passed off successfully. The crowd was larger than had been expected. Among those present and taking part in the march were many members of the Lloyd Wendell chapter, UDC of Taylor, and of the McGee Brigham chapter, UDC of Jonah, both of which had aided generously in putting up the fund for the monument. Of the Confederate veteran camps in the county, large delegations were present from all: Camp LaSure of Georgetown, the Taylor Camp, and the Liberty Hill Leander Camp. 2 or 3 of the veterans who were present were not able physically to march in the procession, but enjoyed the speeches and other exercises. The monument is very graceful and beautiful. It is about 7 feet 3 inches at the base and 21 feet high. There is a drinking fountain about 3 feet from the base, and a few feet above this is a graceful insert carrying an electric light globe. Surmounting the shaft is the figure of a Confederate soldier standing at ground arms. The 4 sides are marked infantry, artillery, cavalry, navy, and on the lower section, in memory of the Confederate soldiers and sailors. Now, here is Representative Buchanan's speech. In this issue, The Sun publishes the address of Honorable J.P. Buchanan, Congressman from the 10th District, delivered at the unveiling of the Confederate monument last Friday. We hope our readers will carefully read it and then paste it and the account of the unveiling found in this issue in their scrapbooks. It is worthy of preservation as it is a brief, strong, and forceful parsing of the Southern view of secession. This was the view that our fathers believed in, for which they fought, and for which many of them sacrificed their lives, and most of them their fortunes. Never were people more honest in their view, and Mr. Buchanan shows that as far as history and the Constitution are concerned, they were not only honest, but right. Remember, we're not stirring up the ashes of the trouble, we're just insisting that we were right. Even those who differ with them, who believe that the North was right to fight for the Union, are bound to acknowledge not only their honesty, but in a strict juristic letter of the law view, they were right. So even people who disagree have to agree. All right, now we begin the actual speech. Honorable J.P. Buchanan speech. Madam President, daughters of the Confederacy, Confederate veterans, ladies and gentlemen, it is with unaffected diffidence that I assume the honors of this great occasion in compliance with the compliments conveyed by your invitation. I do not understand the temperament that can face such a duty without a due sense of its high significance, that indifference that can entertain the scope and meaning of the unveiling and dedication of a memorial to the Confederate soldier with no sense of emotion is inconceivable to me. The speech is divided up into little subsections, and each one of them has a title, and I don't know how he gave those titles as he was speaking. Those might have been just part of the text, or he added them for the newspaper presentations. But this part is Revolutionary War, the first war of secession in our history. A nation is like a family in its infancy. It is noted for its simple manners, frugal habits, and honest intentions, but with success comes power, with power comes wealth, with wealth comes avarice, greed, and dishonesty, with avarice, greed, and dishonesty comes plots, schemes, conspiracies, and unlawful combinations to obtain the upper hand in the industrial and political affairs of a nation. It is worth noting that prior to the secessions, 7 of the 8 richest states in the Union were Southern states. So if there was a greed and avarice being driven by great wealth, we know where it would come from. It's also worth noting that the overwhelming majority of the presidents prior to Lincoln had in fact been Southerners. All right. Such, ladies and gentlemen, has been the history of our country. When we take a retrospect of the history of our ancestry, we will find that throughout their entire history, their dominant and controlling characteristic was an intense love for and insistence upon the right of local self-government and a corresponding hatred of foreign potentate, king, or distant authority dictating and controlling their local government and domestic institutions. It was the insistence upon these inherited principles which resulted in them forcing from King John the great Magna Carta. It was the exercise of these inherited principles by which they freed themselves from the domestic, ecclesiastical, and political vassalage of the Stuarts and established the eternal principle of the Bill of Rights. It was the controlling influence of these inherited principles which caused them to flee from the despotic power of Germany, the iron rule of Cromwell, and the intolerance of the Stuarts. You will notice there that our ancestry is entirely British and German. Right? So this is not a speech directed equally at all residents of Williamson County. So count and peasant, cavalier and Puritan, willingly encountered the then dangers of an ocean voyage and landed where the wild Atlantic hurls its foam-crested waves against the rock-bound shores of New England, where they undertook the Herculean task of constructing a civilization in a boundless, trackless wilderness, inhabited by wild and savage beasts and by wilder and more savage men. They did all of this that they might be their own masters, that they might worship God according to the dictates of their own conscience, that they might stand up erect in conscious dignity of equal freedom, equal rights, equal opportunities, and enjoy the blessings of liberty. But the dangers encountered by them in contending with the wild beast and wilder and more savage men were infinitesimal when compared with those yet to come from civilized men. As soon as these American colonies, each holding a separate charter or Bill of Rights from the King of England, had, in a measure, conquered the beasts, the savage, the wilderness, and the productive soil of America began to yield in abundance, England, that had grown avaricious and dishonest through success, violated the granted chartered rights of the colonies and levied unjust and oppressive taxation on them without giving them representation in Parliament. When each colony, acting for itself alone, seceded from the mother country, that didn't happen. And as Washington said, if they didn't all hang together, they would hang separately. Each sent delegates to conferences where they formulated and agreed to the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, reserving to the states full sovereignty and all rights not expressly granted to Congress. You will notice that that was Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. Then it was that Jefferson wrote, and they published to the world the immortal Declaration of Independence, declaring the political equality of mankind, the right of a majority to govern, their duty to so govern as to preserve inviolate the sacred rights of the minority, with no end in view but the protection of life, liberty, property, and social order. Through 7 years of civil war, privations, death, havoc, and destruction, they successfully established the great principles of the Declaration of Independence, consecrated with the blood of patriots. This was the first war of secession in our history. Its righteousness has been, is, and will forever be unanimously proclaimed by the citizens of this country, both North and South. If then our revolutionary fathers were right in seceding from England, certainly the South was right in seceding from the Union, because it had greater provocation and occupied higher grounds. You would expect that he's eventually going to tell us what that provocation is in some detail. You would be disappointed. The 13 sovereign states form a more perfect union. When the Revolutionary War terminated successfully from the revolutionists, in 1783, England acknowledged each of the 13 American colonies as distinct, separate, independent sovereign nations. These 13 sovereign nations, that never happened. These 13 sovereign nations continued to act under their respective state constitutions and under the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union until 1789, when it was realized that insufficient powers had been granted to the federal government to protect us from foreign enemies and deal effectively with interstate and other national subjects. Delegates were then selected by these sovereign states and sent to conventions to propose amendments to the Articles of Confederation and form a more perfect union, with the result that our present Constitution was proposed and acceded to, state by state, with no provision in it providing for a perpetual union, and with no time fixed in it for its undissolved continuance. The provision for a perpetual union, as contained in the old Articles of Confederation, was intentionally left out of the new compact, or more perfect union. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, it was distinctly understood by the framers of this compact or constitution that it was merely an experiment, and that each and every state that acceded to it had and held the right to withdraw or secede from it for any cause, great or small. That was not universally agreed to. There were lots of different people with lots of different interpretations of the thing that they were doing. One of the most important things to understand about American history is that there's no such person as like the Founding Fathers. There were a whole bunch of people with a whole bunch of conflicting agendas, and they were trying to all shove them into the same document, which each one of them would then have a conflicting interpretation thereof later on. So it is simply not true to say the founders thought much of anything, really. But he claims, if such had not been the understanding, the Constitution could not have been adopted. New York, Rhode Island, and Virginia specifically acceded to it on the express condition that the powers delegated to the general government should be resumed by them when necessary to their happiness. It is and always has been the law in all ages and with all races and nations that a contract, compact, or constitution which contains no limitations as to the time of its existence and contains no provisions making it perpetual subsists only at the pleasure of the parties to it. It is worthwhile that the parties to the Constitution, it opens up with, we the people. And at the time, the Anti-Federalists thought that was really obnoxious. It should have been we the states. So if we're going for, the wording favors my interpretation, or we the people ordained and established the Constitution, the states, people met in conventions in states, but the people made the Constitution. It is and has forever been the law in all ages and with all races and nations that when one or more parties to a contract, compact, or constitution, whether between individual states or nations, reserves the right to secede from it or resume the powers delegated, then every party to such contract, compact, or constitution has the same right. Next section. Northern states and New England politicians acknowledge right of secession. Daniel Webster, the greatest Republican orator and statesman and advocate of nationalism, was forced to admit in 1833 in Hayne-Webster's debate in Congress that if a league between sovereign powers has no limitation as to time and contains nothing to make it perpetual, it subsists only during the good pleasure of the parties. Again, the legislatures of 14 of the northern states passed laws nullifying the provisions of the Constitution. You'd have to ask which ones. Passed laws nullifying the provisions of the Constitution and laws of Congress passed in pursuance thereof and in accord therewith relative to the return of fugitive slaves. And on this subject, Daniel Webster said, It has been said in the states of New York, Massachusetts, and Ohio that the fugitive slave law shall not be executed in such states. These proceedings are distinctly treasonable. Whatever happened to those states' rights? I do not hesitate to say and repeat that if the northern states willfully and deliberately refuse to carry out that part of the Constitution which respects the restoration of fugitive slaves, the South would no longer be bound to keep the compact. A bargain broken on one side is broken on all. Again, Henry Cabot Lodge, U.S. Senator from Massachusetts and a strong Union Republican, in his Life of Daniel Webster said, "When the Constitution was adopted by a vote of the states in Philadelphia, it was not adopted by a vote of the states, in Philadelphia, and accepted by the vote of the states in popular conventions. That didn't happen. It was accepted by a vote of the people in state conventions. It is safe to say that there was not a man in the country from Washington and Hamilton on one side, George Clinton and George Mason on the other, who regarded the new system as anything but an experiment entered upon by the states in which each and every state had the right peacefully to withdraw, a right which was very likely to be exercised." John Quincy Adams in 1839, in discussing the Constitution of the United States, stated, "To the people alone is there reserved as well the dissolving in the constituent powers of the Union, and the people of each state have the right to secede from the Confederated Union." William H. Seward, who was afterwards in President Lincoln's cabinet in 1844, said, "This union must be a voluntary one. A union upheld by force would be a despotism." Next section, federal government recognizes right of secession and foreign statesmen confirm it. I'm not really sure why we care about foreign statesmen, but anyway, here they're going to be. Why, ladies and gentlemen, for 50 years after the Constitution was acceded by all the states, the federal government, acknowledging the right of each and every state to peaceably secede from the Union, taught this doctrine of secession in its military school at West Point, New York. Rawls' view of the Constitution was the textbook officially adopted by the federal government in which constitutional law was taught in our military academy at West Point, in which I find the following language. If a faction should attempt to subvert the government of a state for the purpose of destroying its republican form, the national powers of the Union should be called forth to subdue it. Yet it is not to be understood that its interposition would be justifiable if a state should determine to retire from the Union. It depends on the state itself whether it will continue a member of the Union. To deny this right would be inconsistent with the principles on which all our political systems are founded. The states, then, may wholly withdraw from the Union. The secession of a state from the Union depends on the will of the people of such state. It was foreseen that there would be a natural tendency to increase the number of states. It was also known that a state might withdraw itself. This right of secession must be considered an ingredient in the original composition of the general government. Notably, this is a lot of interpreters after the fact saying what everybody knew. But he's not giving us evidence of everyone actually knowing it at the time, leaving a bit of an open question. Impartial statesmen of foreign countries declare right of secession in each state. I cannot close these quotations without giving you the view that impartial, unbiased, and profound statesmen take of this question. De Tocqueville, the eminent French statesman, profound thinker, author, and patriot, was by his government sent to America to study our system of government, and in his Democracy in America, published in 1835, says, "However strong a government may be, it cannot easily escape from a principle which it has once admitted as the foundation of its constitution. The Union was formed by the voluntary agreement of the states, and in uniting together they have not forfeited their nationality. If one of the states choose to withdraw its name from the contract, it would be difficult to disprove its right of doing so, and the federal government of maintaining its claim directly either by force or by right." New England states first threatened secession from Union. I could go on, ladies and gentlemen, for hours with these quotations and demonstrate beyond question that at the time of the adoption of the Constitution and for 50 years thereafter, that all the authors of the Constitution, all informed men of the North and the South, the people of all the states and the statesmen of foreign countries, clearly understood that the Constitution of the United States was a compact, a confederation, acceded to by separate, independent, sovereign states, and that each had and held the right to withdraw or secede from the Union for any cause, great or small, and that the federal government had not the semblance of right to coerce, invade, or subjugate a state, whether in or out of the Union. If such was not true, why was it that in 1803, more than 15 years before the sectional agitation of the slavery questions, and 57 years before the war between the states, when Louisiana applied for admission as a state to the Union, that we find that the legislature of the loyal Union state of Massachusetts passed the following resolution: Resolved, that the annexation of Louisiana to the Union transcends the Constitution's power of the government of the United States, formed a new confederacy to which the states united by the former compact are not bound to adhere. In connection with this resolution, United States Senator Pickering strongly advocated a Northern Confederacy and consequently a secession from the Union. Josiah Quincy, member of Congress from Massachusetts, speaking in Congress against the admission of Louisiana as a state, said, "If this bill passes, it is my deliberate opinion that it is virtually a dissolution of the Union, that it will free the states from their moral obligation, and as it will be the right of all, so it will be the duty of some to prepare for separation, amicably if they can, violently if they must." In 1809, John Quincy Adams declared that unless the Embargo Act of Congress was repealed, all the New England states would withdraw from the Union, and he actually opened negotiations with Great Britain toward that end. Daniel Webster, the Northern expounder of the Constitution and advocate of a strong centralized government, was violently opposed to the War of 1812. It was during that year he wrote the Rockingham Memorial, which threatened secession on behalf of the northern states. There is some exaggeration there. During the War of 1812, when the country had been basically cut in half, the federal government was no longer exerting power in New England, and some New England states were like, well, I mean, we're kind of screwed, and there were a handful of people who were like, well, let's secede. They were pretty much nixed by their governors and stuff like that. So there were definitely some Yankees who thought they could secede. Most Yankees didn't seem to be interested in the idea. In 1814, the legislature of Massachusetts passed a resolution inviting all New England states to a convention to consider of their public grievances and concern, which resulted in the celebrated Hartford Convention, in which all New England states were represented. This was a null event, right? It was designed to be ineffectual, in which all New England states were represented, which sent delegates to Washington to make some arrangements by which Massachusetts, separately or in concert with the neighboring states, may be able to assume the defense of their territories against the enemy. This union, he says, it's this union. It was in this connection that Daniel Webster said in Congress, "It is the solemn duty of the state government to protect their own authority over their own militia and to interpose between their own citizens and arbitrary power of the national government. I shall exhort them to exercise their rights by providing for the security of their liberties." All right, so there's people with opinions. Abolition Party denounces our Constitution as a league with death and a covenant with hell. In 1831, the Abolition Party began to attract attention. Its political organ, the Liberator, denounced our Constitution as a league with death and a covenant with hell, because it recognized the right of property in slaves, and this notwithstanding the fact that under the Constitution of the United States, the maintenance or destruction of the institution of slavery in any state was left exclusively to the sovereign will of the people of such sovereign state. The Abolition Party, composed principally of the immediate descendants of the northern slave trader, passed the following resolution: resolved that the only exodus of the slave to freedom is over the remains of the present American church and the grave of the present Union. Resolved that the abolitionist should make it one of the primary objects of this agitation to dissolve the American Union. And you will note that dissolving the Union to abolish slavery and dissolving the Union to preserve slavery are not the same. North and South, and he's going to kind of reiterate for a while. North and South conceded right of secession for 50 years after Constitution was adopted. It thus appears from the verities of history, from the recorded facts, that all our fathers who wrote and framed our Constitution recognized the right of secession as an ingredient constituent in our original political organism, that the federal government up to 1840 recognized and taught the doctrine of secession in its military academy at West Point, that the Democrats of the North and South recognized the right of secession, that the Republican or Nationalist recognized, claimed, and threatened secession, that the people of New England recognized, claimed the right of, and threatened secession on 4 occasions prior to 1860, that the Abolitionist recognized the right of and threatened secession and declared it to be their primary object to dissolve the Union. New section. Northern states nullified the Constitution and sectional president and Congress solely responsible for war. And yet, when after 14 northern states had, through their state legislatures, unconstitutionally passed laws nullifying provisions of the Constitution and laws of Congress, passed in pursuance thereof and in accord therewith, that is to say, when some northern states were exercising their states' rights, and when Congress, through the votes and influence of northern senators and representatives, had passed a law prohibiting the people of the South from moving with their property into many of the territories of the United States. Which property was that? No such law was ever passed, but they wanted to forbid slavery in the territories that had been taken from Mexico in the Mexican-American War. Southerners were perfectly welcome to go there. They just couldn't take their slaves according to various proposed laws that were never actually passed. That's the property. Anyway, into these territories, which belonged in common to all the people of the United States, in direct violation of the Constitution which they were sworn to support, and which was so held by the Supreme Court of the United States. There's plainly nothing in the Constitution guaranteeing that you can have slavery in the territory. representatives. And when, after Lincoln's election, the people of the South, through their representatives in Congress and otherwise, exhausted every means to compromise the differences between the two sections, South Carolina had seceded within a week of the election. There were no efforts to compromise anything. Extended every means to compromise the difference between the two sections in order to avoid the impending conflict, and when after every proposition submitted by the Southern representatives was rejected by the Northern Republicans, and they solemnly refused to submit any counter-propositions, the sovereign states of the South exercised their heretofore unquestioned constitutional right of peaceably withdrawing or seceding from the Union. And you will notice that there's a complete skipping of why they did that. Right? The thing is, everybody agrees people have rights to secede from governments if those governments are unjust. If those governments are unjust, right? So when we want to say the Founding Fathers were right to secede from the British Empire, great. What justified them in breaking the law in that way? The fact that they were subject to taxation without representation and a handful of other issues. Okay, what justified the South seceding from the Union? And he skipped that. Right? He's put a lot of effort into saying that there's a constitutional right to do it, but why were they exercising that constitutional right? Just to do it? That would be like showing up to the courthouse and demanding a trial by jury, not having been accused of any crime. You don't do something just because you have the right to. You do it for some reason. Right? So he's gone on at length, and not unpersuasively, that people in 1860, in 1861, could sincerely think that a state had the right to secede from the Union for just cause. That doesn't make their actual cause just if it turns out that their cause was exclusively slavery, which, as all Southern states made very clear, was their sole and exclusive justification. All right. So the sovereign states of the South exercised their heretofore unquestioned constitutional right of peaceably withdrawing or seceding from the Union. The then sectional Republican Party, through its sectional president and sectional representatives in Congress, waged war on the South and brought on and were solely responsible for the 4 years of discord, conflict, war, havoc, devastation, and destruction. I mean, we have skipped who fired the first shot there. Cause of the war was a determined effort of the North to gain political ascendancy over the South. What then was the cause of the sectional war, and who was responsible for it? It, quote, was the systematic and persistent struggle, end quote, and determination of the politicians of the North to, quote, deprive the Southern states of equality in the Union, end quote, gain control of the national government, and, quote, discriminate in legislation against the interests of the people, end quote. What discrimination exactly does he have? And he doesn't tell us who he's quoting from, but what discrimination? And, the Southern states said at the time, you're not going to give us our slaves back. You might be banning the interstate slave trade, stuff like that. You're not letting us take our slaves to the territories. We can't handle that. So you're going to discriminate against slavery. Well, we can't be part of your country anymore. It was a war brought on by the politicians of the North, for the politicians of the North, bravely and fiercely fought by the people of both sections. Oh, the stern and incorruptible virtues of our revolutionary fathers, tried and strengthened in the crucible of a long conflict for liberty, were a sufficient guarantee against corruption and extirpation, but the scepter had passed into the hands of a new generation, and the mantle of revolutionary purity did not descend with it. The tide of usurpation and corruption had commenced, and it never flows backwards. But he hasn't told us what was being usurped and what the corruption consisted in. And we know from primary historical documents from the period the exact thing that the Southern states were complaining about. It was a usurpation of their right to take slaves to the territories, right to trade slaves across state borders, things like that. The South waited, hoped, and struggled to avoid the war, but in vain. The fatal poisons having been infused in a vital part of the system, nothing was left for us but to await the issue with melancholy resignation. Oh, our northern leaders were forbearing, quote, still hoping, still striving for peace and union, until a sectional president nominated by a sectional convention and elected by a sectional vote, and that the vote of a minority of the people, end quote, with the warning that the Union could not continue to exist in the condition it was formed in its Constitution adopted by our fathers of revolutionary purity. Then it was the South peaceably withdrew from the Union, as it had a right to do in order to escape from injury, oppression, and strife in the Union. We need to know what injury, oppression, and strife are at issue, and to enjoy peace, prosperity, and happiness out of it. 12 propositions, which the verities of history establish beyond question. Ladies and gentlemen, I am proud of the fact that this imposing monument has been erected in this beautiful city of Georgetown, not only because her citizenship cultivate those high ideals which produce the loftiest conception of life, but also because Georgetown is the home of that great educational institution, Southwestern University, from whose classic halls flow a continuous vitalizing moral current which enriches the hearts and instructs the minds of all who come in contact therewith. By reason of the fact that Georgetown is the source of this beneficent vitalizing current, which extends throughout the length and breadth of the state and then some, I feel it my imperative duty to state the following 12 propositions, which the verities of history establish beyond questions, and I challenge any man, North or South, to assail or controvert any of them. 1. That in the beginning, each state was in all things an independent sovereign nation. That these sovereign states voluntarily created a federal government by delegating to it certain specified rights and powers. We the people. That this federal government possessed only such rights and powers as were expressly delegated to it by the states, and such incidental powers as were necessary to carry into effect the specified delegated powers. That the right or powers to coerce or invade a state was not given or delegated to the federal government. That any state had the right to secede or withdraw from the federal government when it transcended any of its delegated powers, as contained in the Constitution, or exercise powers not expressly delegated to it by the states. That's true. They then have to ask why that would be relevant by asking what the federal government was planning on doing that would have violated the Constitution. That the federal government prior to the war did transcend its rights, and usurp and exercise powers not contained in the Constitution and not delegated to it by the states, which was so decided by the Supreme Court of the United States. That 14 states prior to the war nullified provisions of the United States Constitution and thereby breached the compact of the Constitution. That the North was responsible for the causes which led to the war between the states. Nope, you just kind of made that one up. That the North was solely responsible for the existence of the institution of slavery in the United States. He's put so much effort into avoiding mentioning slavery, but he finally had to mention it. And no, the North is not solely responsible for the existence of slavery in the United States. The Yankees did an awful lot of bringing over slaves. Most of the slaves were then bought by Southerners. It is not true that the North is solely responsible for the introduction of slavery into the United States. A lot of Yankees were definitely involved in the slave trade, right? I mean, the North is not free of the sin of slavery, but solely, most of the slaves that were brought over, they then sold in the South. In the beginning, the South protested against slavery, and this Pandora box cannot truthfully be laid at her door. The South didn't particularly protest against slavery. I mean, there were times and places. That the South, not being able to procure the protection of her rights as guaranteed under the Constitution of the Union, peaceably withdrew from the Union that she might enjoy peace, happiness, and prosperity out of it. Okay, but which right weren't they enjoying? And the only one that he's mentioned is the right to capture fugitive slaves in the North. That the North was the aggressor in the war from the very beginning, for assumption to the contrary notwithstanding, and undertook the invasion of the southern states. That the South only defended herself against this unconstitutional invasion by the North. Next section. 600,000 poorly equipped Southern soldiers held at bay 2,778,203 well-equipped Union soldiers for 4 long years. Ah, how well she defended herself. Let the recorded facts speak. 600,000 Southern soldiers, all patriots, not sure to what country, not a Judas Iscariot or Benedict Arnold in the bunch, placed themselves between their loved ones, their homes and firesides, and an invading foe of 2,778,203 men. When you check military theory, you find that actually like a 4 or 5 to 1 advantage is considered to be necessary to secure victories. That's given that the North was on the offensive and the South was on the defense, that's actually, it's not crazy odds. The 600,000 Confederates with insufficient and antiquated arms, with no money, no credit, no provisions, no clothes, no munitions of war, quote, no skilled labor to produce any of these indispensable appliances of war themselves, no navy and no central government. They had a central government. It was actually rather dictatorial in the economic sphere. The 2,778,203 Union soldiers were panoplied for success by all that the organized discipline of organized government and unlimited resources commanded, supplied to the limit with all the military appliances of the time, and yet this little band of Dixie boys, little when compared with the Union Army, by their bravery, their heroism, their fortitude, their fidelity to duty, and self-sacrificing spirits, held at bay this well-equipped invading host for 4 long years. North could not whip the South by themselves, but had to hire 494,900 foreign soldiers who fought not for principle, but for Northern gold. I think he just complained about the all-volunteer force. All the nations of the, quote, earth looked on in wonder and amazement while the gigantic proportions of this awful war bound forth as its hideous engine of destruction of human life and everything of human structure were terribly displayed in the sanguinary progress and horrible duration. End quote. Confederates, they could never have overcome you in a fair fight. They struck below the belt. This was supposed to be a fight between the North and South. As it terminated, you were fighting the world. The first and second years of this war had passed, and you had thrashed them in nearly every battle. Realizing they could not whip you by themselves, notwithstanding the fact that they outnumbered you more than 5-1, they sent to foreign countries and hired 494,900 foreign soldiers to come here and fight the Americans upon American soil. They enlisted 680,917 foreign and Negro soldiers in the Union Army, which was 80,917 more hirelings, or worse, than the entire Southern Army. Notice who he was just excluded from the actual Union Army. So, they had some black people in there, but they were hirelings or worse. The Confederate soldier, quote, fought a good fight. He kept the faith, end quote. In this unequal contest, the Confederate soldier leapt into undying fame and verified his sublimated character by every test known to the standards of civilization and under the trying analysis of war. What other people on the same common soil ever proclaimed their independence in the face of overwhelming odds of hostile forces and with only their sense of right to uphold them? I mean, there have been lots of people who fought for freedom, but they were fighting for freedom to have slavery. Gosh, the American Revolution was harder. They would do right and fear not, that's a quote, and die for the principle that inspired them to sacrifice themselves for the independence that was theirs by every claim of justice and honor and constitutional fair dealing. What other soldier ever staked his all for the ideals of a political faith and construed a governmental doctrine as commensurate with a religious creed? States' rights should not be a religion. The Confederate soldier fought for principles, not dollars. That was the honor roll that carried its enlisted votaries through every trial and for 4 long years exemplified the fidelity of the Confederate soldier to the principles of a political school that stood for civil and religious liberty as fundamental to the Bill of Rights, and clung to the tenets of personal liberty and local self-government as essential to the integrity of the law of human freedom itself. For this he gave himself, and with the farewell and Godspeed of loving home folks, he tore himself from the fond embraces of devoted friends and kindred to march and battle through the long night of danger and desperate privation that his generation, and you and I, might live beneath the folds of a banner unfurled in the sacred cause of an independent Dixieland. This is not the language that you use when you're being kind of neutral, and, it was said that we were not trying to stir up the embers of resentment. That's what these words do. Antiquated weapons became irresistible when wielded by incarnate hands of Southern valor. And the out-of-date flintlock musket and all his antiquated weapons became the irresistible instruments of the marvelous soldier when wielded by the incarnate hands of Southern valor. With whatever he could equip himself, victory after victory perched upon the banner of the Stars and Bars, and many a regiment and brigade of the Dixie Boys were armed from the costly and hard-won spoils of war. Can you cite another instance of human experience in which the defeat of a foe was so largely in the agency of supply and equipment for inferior numbers and limited supplies? Literally every war is fundamentally a logistical struggle, so yes, I can. That of itself distinguished the Confederate soldier as without a peer in all the fighting forces of the annals of time, and that whether in victory or defeat, whether languishing in prison or footsore and weary on the march, whether in uniform or in rags, whether hungry or feasting on the fat of the land, by the occasional requisition upon the enemy, that is to say, theft and plunder, and contribution whenever fair hands could reach her heroes, He was the constant character of steady and indomitable bearing, ready at all times to sing, "Now let the big guns rattle as they will, we'll be gay and happy still," or with the rebel yell upon his lips to charge and carry the battle tide on the point of the bayonet. But the 600,000 enlistments of the South could not forever cope with the hordes of home and foreign powers, and an inevitable exhaustion was the final fate as the worn columns sank before the most tremendous army hitherto known, of more than 2.5 millions of armed men drawn from the four quarters of the earth. When the depleted and famished veterans of a young nation stacked arms at Appomattox and gave up the struggle for their rightful sovereignty, the dying day was lit with a sunset splendor that painted a resurrection morn, for each Confederate soldier could truthfully exclaim, with St. Paul, "I have fought a good fight, I have finished my course, I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me at that day." No Confederate ever answered the call of any court for treason, and the traitor's brand never seared his spotless brow. Did you ask which side was right in this unfortunate and unnecessary fratricidal conflict? Bro, if you're here not to stir up ancestral resentments, no, don't ask that. The North, with its might and power, overcame the South with its right and weakness, but let us remember no Confederate has ever answered the call of any court for treason, and the traitor's brand has never seared his spotless brow. Oh, 'tis true that that scholar, that soldier, that statesman and patriot, the peerless chieftain of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, was arrested, imprisoned, and, like Paul and Silas, lay bound in jail with millions crying out for his trial and conviction for treason. The victorious Union, with all its power and influence, with all its prestige, passion, and prejudice, arrayed itself against our defeated chieftain, who was imprisoned in irons welded around his ankles, and thus the great question of whether the North or the South was right was brought to a decisive issue. The federal government employed the best lawyers that unlimited resources could command, who searched libraries, ransacked precedents, scrutinized the history of our and all other governments from their inception in the vain hope of finding some semblance of law, some precedent, on which they could have a claim for conviction of Jefferson Davis on the charge of treason, of high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, Jefferson Davis obviously waged war against the United States. I mean, and that's the definition constitutionally of treason. However, the Attorney General decided that you could only be tried for treason in the jurisdiction in which you had been present while committing it, which was Richmond. And the Yankees were like, there's no way there's no loyalty oath or any other test we could possibly make that is going to guarantee 12 jurors 12 Richmond jurors are all going to agree that secession was illegal and hence that he was waging war against the United States illegally. If they just had the trial in Pennsylvania, where Jefferson Davis's army was waging war against the United States, or if they had it in Ohio, which was invaded by the South, or if they had it in New Mexico, which was invaded by this, there's a whole lot of places where they could have had this trial, but not Richmond. So this is just, that part is just completely devoid of truth. The intrepid spirit of the great imprisoned and shackled Jefferson Davis rose to sublime heights at the prospect of having the great question determined in a court of justice, in a court whereof justice and right reigned supreme. But they were afraid to give him a trial, and their own lawyers, their own Supreme Court, was forced by an honest conscience to say, "We find no political sin in this man. Go hence without delay." That's his own quotation. That nobody ever said that. So the line is, "We find no political sin in this man. Go hence without delay." This forever settled it, Confederates, that you were right, which has long ago been recorded, quote, "In heaven above where all is love, and Jesus reigns supreme." So far, he has explained at great length that people thought that states had a right to secede. Now here's why the monument is here. During the dark days of Reconstruction, the victories of peace won by Confederate men and women were more renowned than those of war. In the wreckage of defeat, the true and virile manhood of Southern character struck hands with adversity, and the peerless soldier was instantly transmuted into the invincible citizen and statesman. With the shadow of the black man hanging over every home like the pall of death, an avatar of infamy, a decree of damnation, the victorious republicanism of that day determined not to withdraw its mailed hand of conquest and forego its vindictive and voracious purpose until its dream of perpetual power had been secured. Now, what exactly did Reconstruction consist in? And the answer is trying to secure the right to vote for black men, right? So the guy was dedicating this monument, and he describes African Americans as the shadow of the black man hanging over every Southern home, like a pall of death, an avatar of infamy, a decree of damnation. Right? We're pretty racist. The slavery of the Negro had not yet been perfected in his transit to the ownership of his political master. The rivets of the shackles that were to bind that mass of bewildered ignorance to the juggernaut of the Republican Party had not yet been clenched. That scheme must be certified and realized at every risk, though the nation be sacrificed to the rapacious maw of a sanctified piracy. This guy's a Democrat, and this is a campaign speech. During this dark and dismal period, the blackest page of American history, the victories of peace won by the Confederate men and women were more, quote, renowned than those of war, end quote. For within a decade, through the gloom and death grapple of all the Reconstruction horrors, the reincarnated sunny South, of and by its own motion and resourceful self, had broken the hated and despicable shackles of an alien tyranny, which consisted in black men getting to vote, and cast them beyond the confines of its long conflict with despair. And the cry of dismay ran through the legislative halls of the nation, "My God, the Confederate brigadiers have captured Congress." That is, at the erection of this monument, they were celebrating the Confederate victory after the Civil War. This is explicitly a monument to the victory of terrorism over freedom after the Civil War. The Confederate soldier stands with the giants of civic talent and administrative genius in any land, in any clime. And today, with all the reconstructed states anchored in their ancient harbor, they are in equal and mutual fellowship with every section of the Union, and they are established in power and influence in the affairs of the nation, thanks to the statesmanship that springs from the loins of the Confederate soldier. And who can but stand with the giants of civic talent and administrative genius in any land, in any clime? Ladies and gentlemen, I've not recited these harrowing instances with any intention of attempting to fan into flame the smoldering coals of a buried past. I merely claim the right, on any and all occasions, to vindicate the cause for which the Confederate fought, suffered, bled, and died, and I as freely concede the same right to the sons of those who wore the blue. But guys, the causes can't both be equally right. Right? Your cause was slavery. You can't vindicate that. We all concede that we now have an indestructible union of indestructible states, and all sectional animosity is, or should be, consigned to oblivion. But certainly we are all privileged to boast a splendid lineage and to enjoy surpassing distinction of hereditary honor. Descended from the finest strain that ever achieved immortality in the arena of war, born and bred of the greatest line of mariners that ever sailed a ship or crew that ever commanded a navy, or roamed the seas to the terror of hostile fleets, hand and glove and heart and soul and part and parcel with our kindred of the hustings and the forum, whose puissant powers sustain and guide the nation, it is ours to see that testimonials of affection shall commemorate the noble sacrifices of our noble sires, and to perpetuate the truths of history. No artist's dream and no handiwork of shaft or statue or obelisk or arch of graceful bronze or graven stone can measure the merit due the memory of the Confederate veteran for that endless, unending time, for every element and article of manly purpose and efficient power clings to his unique personality and his historic character. And we may rest assured that all the ideals of knighthood's charm will glorify the story of the South, that its historic dead will never lie in neglected or forgotten graves. For today, we bow in the presence of the queenly daughters of Texas, and they, in their tireless sisterhood of Dixie, are the pledged champions of the truths of history, to be the everlasting tale impressively and imposingly told by this exquisite imagery from the devoted hearts and tender hands of the United Daughters of the Confederacy of Williamson County, Texas. Next section. Creation of woman, the crowning act of God. These achievements, and such scenes as honor us today, were born when the bloom and fragrance of the green glories of Eden sanctified the crowning act of creation. The solitary human soul of those embowered shades was without an ideal until, quote, the divinity that shapes our ends declared, "It is not good that man should be alone," and at once met the social issue. the thoughtfulness that gave him a companion equipped the world for its intricate duties and completed the well-rounded genesis of man. And the scriptural helpmeet for him has proved the inspired element in the pursuit of happiness throughout all the toils and trials of the human struggle. As the stately ship glides across the harbor bar by the obscure power of the panting tug that steams close to the moving hulk, so the heartthrob of sympathy that drives and guides the courses and harsher routines of our daily lives moves through its appointed task by the resistless flow of the quiet current. As the invisible energy conquers the ways of travel and commerce, so the inobtrusive mystery of a spiritual influence subdues the rugged course, and the destiny of the world moves at the will of gentle and persuasive voices. Love's pleadings have always whispered hope to the despondent. The deep wells of affection have ever freshened the wilderness of sorrow, and stimulated the drooping strength and fired the discouraged life to honorable deeds. Of course, the distinctive graces of the sunny South will live in the hearts and minds of her sons, and he who dares to disrespect her idols by epithet or sign of contempt will surely clash with the champions of the land, where lie in hallowed graves dust of their immemorial dead. That is a threat to murder black men. UDC, most famous commemorative body of women on earth. What more sure than that the women of Southern ties and memories should, with her instinctive benevolence and sympathy, gravitate into the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the most famous commemorative body that ever blessed this troubled earth? And how fortunate that the war-spent veterans should meet on the threshold of defeat the tireless devotion of the wonderful sisterhood of the UDC to stand for them through every vicissitude and to comfort them in every occasion of distress. The war cloud had barely lifted when these noble women were moving upon their consecrated mission, and wherever the stricken soldier needed her in want or suffering, her ministering hands were ready with food or bandage to feed the famished body or bind the bleeding wound. At the thought of the Confederate home or pension, all her powers were enlisted, and every scheme to accomplish these splendid institutions were put in motion. And wherever that soldier's haven of refuge and of rest is located, the unfailing UDC is the glorious spirit of mercy, ever at hand to sacrifice for the emergencies of life or death, and to canonize in the calendar of immortality the role of ideal honor. The UDCs stand for the truth of history. It is hers to contend for the faith and the facts that the truths of history may avoid the disparagement of what is dearer to her than life itself, and no rank misrepresentation can survive under the ban of her fierce displeasure. Who does not remember how fearlessly she defied the invidious attacks that sought the extinction of the Dixie spirit, that held in check the cruelties of the political conspirators who would destroy her idols of home and country? It was hers to inspire the forensic, courage and skill of our political gladiators to win the battle royale that paved the way to the house of our fathers and made it an open door for all coming time. She knew, and we know, that the Confederate soldier has won eternal place in the affairs of the Republic and was crowned with eternal fame as the constructive statesman of those critical days of revolutionary reform. It is marvelous that, through the complex and constant activity of this distinguished body of Southern womanhood, time enough could be found to erect a greater number and variety of monumental tokens than has ever animated the heart and hand of any other people. Trailing the years from the tragic days of the grim-visaged war, we hail these ever-recurring testimonials of remembrance as they spring into place by the unwavering magic of woman's constancy and faith. They've honored and adorned the sacred soil of all the old Confederate states on every appropriate spot. And even in conspicuous cities of the far north, these symbols of love from the hands of undying devotion related from posterity the grandest story of martyrdom and posthumous fame that ever roused the creative fancy of a sculptor's dream. In 1914, UDCs erected imposing Confederate monument in Arlington, which I believe is being removed just about nowish. We would think the climax of her restless importunity had been reached when, on the 4th of June, 1914, in the Confederate section, on the highest point of the National Cemetery at historic Arlington, was unveiled that unrivaled figure of memorial statuary inscribed, "To our dead heroes by the United Daughters of the Confederacy." We would think that the summit of her ambition had been attained when, on the most peculiarly select eminence of all the earth, surrounded by the marble headstones of hundreds of Confederate graves, in full view of the Washington Monument across the Potomac, decorated elaborately with flowers and flags, Union and Confederate, attended by distinguished civic and military and naval guests from near or far, with interested comrade participants of the blue and the gray, with Commander General Bennett H. Young of the United Confederate Veterans and Commander General Washington Gardner of the Grand Army of the Republic, indulging in mutual inscriptions of patriotic eloquence. And when the United Daughters of the Confederacy saw their grand association of great women so proudly and distinctly represented by their President General Mrs. Daisy McLaurin Stevens, they realized their hopes, for they knew their honorable deeds were inscribed in the records of eternity. And when the great personality of the Chief Magistrate of the nation added the final word, as only the graceful periods of President Wilson can do, one brimming cup of happiness was there, for all the people, born north and south, rejoiced over the confirmation of the epoch of the times. The blending of the dust of the blue and the gray foretells the splendor of the future of a reunited people. In the scope of her sublime conception, Arlington is at the zenith of the sky of unity and harmony, for at the national capital this exponent of a blended past and present foretells the splendors of the future for a reunited people. This transcendent object lesson cannot fail to reach the immeasurable power and virtue that belong to a people that dwell together in the bonds of a true fellowship. That is the one glorious concrete idea of Arlington, worth all its cost. Memories of South must be published on rocky side of Georgia's great stone mountain. But there are other things. The ideal memories of the South must be emblazoned in spectacular display by themselves that all who run may read. To this end, the great stone mountain of Georgia must publish for the passing world upon the immense tablature of its rocky side the heroic figures and incidents of our historic Confederate world. No ordinary humanity can do such things, but the day of miracles is revived to the master spirits of our incomparable daughters, and if she chooses, she will dare, and no opposing power can defeat her high purposes, nor stay the chastened grandeur of her lofty appeals for the everlasting memorials of the days that are no more. The Confederate birthright is of the solitary type that made defeat more glorious than the conqueror's grasp of lawless power. And to you, our venerated sires of the holiest era that ever fired the knightly soul of chivalry, we can add no beauty to the perfect garland that decks your dauntless brow. Those garlands were twined by the gentle hands that marked you with the Southern Cross, the birthright of the solitary type that ever made defeat more glorious than the conqueror's grasp of lawless power, because yours was the indisputable cause of justice, of right, of truth. The rights for which you fought and died are rarely contradicted now, and based upon our inherited political principles of civil and religious liberty and local self-government for which the colonies were planted and their independence won, no logical analyst would try to controvert it before any judicial authority. But Madam President, United Daughters of the Confederacy, United Confederate Veterans, ladies and gentlemen, in the name of all the holy memories of the past, by all the noblest hopes of the future, we unveil and transmit to our children and their posterity this beautiful and imposing monumental shaft as an object lesson that it might instill in their hearts and minds forever the eternal truths of history. We ask nothing more and will be satisfied with nothing less. You can evaluate for yourself whether the truths of history are what they were interested in.